Disorder having broken out.
So, hi, Pamela. I'd like to welcome Pamela Fitzpatrick to Praxis TV. Thanks for coming along and agreeing to take part. I know you're really busy, so it's good to have you here.
For inviting me, Mandy.
You're very welcome. So Pamela Fitzpatrick is a Labour councillor in Harrow, and your ward is Headstone South, is that right?
Right.
And you stood for election for, is it Harrow East in 2019?
I did, yes.
Yeah, and had brilliant support from what I've read. Loads of people came.
Support. Yeah, we had hundreds of people coming every day. It was so fantastic.
Yeah.
Just a shame we didn't win, really. But...
I know. I felt that as well. I felt sort of enthused by the number of people who we'd managed to get organised. You know, there was a real determination, wasn't there? It was a grim time, but it was a determined, exhausting time.
It was terrible as well. And I know it shouldn't make a difference, but people were out all day, every day, often in the pouring rain and cold before Christmas, giving up their time. It was really quite amazing, actually. I've never seen that before.
Neither have I. No, I haven't either. And you work in a local law centre, and you have done for a number of years. So that's supporting people to access justice, really, and understand their rights better, I would imagine, in all areas. Is it mainly to do with housing or employment, or?
It's not all areas. So it's something I'm really passionate about because I set the law centre up 11 years ago. So I've kind of spent a lot of time developing it. And it started off very small with just 2 part-time solicitors, but it's now got, I think it's 10 solicitors and a barrister and then other caseworkers. So the main areas of law that it focuses on are those affecting people in poverty, basically, people who are vulnerable. So it deals with welfare benefits, with housing, with immigration. So within immigration, it will be not kind of richer people's immigration issues. It will be asylum seekers, trafficked women, people who are here as a spouse and then face domestic violence. So it's really kind of life-saving to some people and definitely life-changing for a lot of people. So talk a bit more about that later, but it really is something that I feel very strongly about, access to justice and the lack of it for most ordinary people.
How does that interface with CAB's work? Do you work in partnership with them, or?
We do. So the Citizens Advice, law centres are a bit similar to a Citizens Advice, but what they do is they have solicitors who are employed and barristers who are employed, and usually legal aid contracts, so they can get into court to challenge things. So if you get a local authority who tells somebody who's homeless they can't be housed because of their immigration status, let's say, and it's wrong, Citizens Advice can only take it so far, because how do you challenge it? Whereas the law centre can take things to court, can judicially review, and it does frequently. And so therefore you're kind of negotiating in the shadow of the law, and you can use the law to good effect, to change things for everybody for the better. So it's something that you start off feeling really angry about the laws that are there that do not assist people and often cause further oppression to people who are vulnerable, but then really pleased that you can challenge it and have really good successes.
I'll definitely ask you more about that in a bit. You're a regular on Crispin Flintoff's show as well. How is he?
He's good.
Good.
I mean, I really do think Crispin has been one of the heroes of the last year, because you probably know him from his Stand Up for Labour, and that's how I first met him. He did a stand-up event to raise funds when I was a parliamentary candidate, so I met him then. And he really was about comedy, but he was so really angry about some of the things that were going on within the Labour Party that he adapted his programme to include a political element. And so he's really done well. And he has 2 shows a week, and I often appear on the Sunday show. And I attended on the New Year's Eve event, and it was really nice because, I don't know about you, but I was stuck at home on New Year's Eve and thinking, oh, what a start to the new year. But I joined his show and you felt you were part of something. It was really good.
Brilliant.
And it's good humoured. But yeah, he seems fine.
I love his work, and I love that I think when he was standing for NEC, one of his main points was that he feels that CLPs need more funding from the subs that get paid into the party. It's a really, really low percentage that they get at the moment. And that he was arguing for 50%, which is huge. But you can imagine what we could do, you know, with 50%. Everybody's saying that we need to be doing more in communities, and that we need to have physical spaces that are ours, you know, within communities and stuff, so that we can use it as a base for that work and be visible. And I just thought that was absolutely brilliant. No one else was really saying it, you know, but he hits the nail on the head, doesn't he, quite often? So
often. And also what he does is give ordinary people a voice, because he puts out every week, I'm doing a show on this, do you have a view on it? Contact me if you want to speak. So just ordinary members, ordinary working class members often get a voice on a show where, you know, 300 people attending, and also it gets a much wider audience. So I think it's a really, really good thing, and quite unique, actually.
Yeah, it is. And we need that hope, don't we? We need a bit of fun, and we need that hope and a bit of glitz and silliness to keep us going. So I can't not mention that you and I, we're standing on a team for the new Labour Women's Committee. So that's alongside Chloe Hopkins and Ekua Bayunu and Tricia Duncan as well, and that we're also supporting Solma Ahmed, who's backed by Momentum. So that's 6 socialist women for 6 CLP rep places on that new committee, and we need good, solid socialist women to be elected as delegates before the 26th of May. That's something that I can't not mention. So that's how we kind of know each other. Okay, so my first proper question, as always, is, are you yourself working class? And what makes you say, if you are, what makes you say that you are? If you're not, what would you say means, why is it that you would say that you're not?
So I am working class, but if somebody were to look at me, they would say, well, I am now director of a law centre, you know, I have a master's degree, I own my home. All those things would define you, I think, as middle class, quite rightly. However, I think if you grow up as a working class person, it never leaves you. And I grew up in Harlesden, which is quite a poor part of London, in an Irish community. I was from an Irish working class community, and that area of London at that time was largely comprised of a community that was Irish or Jamaican, basically, some other groupings, but that. And the common thing amongst us all was poverty, really. And my parents were poor. They worked really hard. They worked, you know, 3 jobs, but could never earn enough to really support their family. They would never think about claiming benefits or anything. They thought that was shameful. And during that time was the time where there was lots of bombings with the IRA and everything, and they felt ashamed because they were stigmatized as being terrorists in much the way that kind of some of the Muslim community feel now. So we lost our homes several times. We were homeless. We found private rented accommodation. We frequently had the phone disconnected, or, you know, real kind of things. And it leaves you with a bit of shame and trying to hide what's going on at home. And I left school really early because I felt I needed to get a job, because there just wasn't, you know, it wasn't even kind of within my kind of thinking that I could go to university. Not that I wasn't kind of good at school or anything, but just the thought that you just needed to go and get a job. And that's what I did. So I didn't actually go to university till much later. In fact, when I had my young children, so I did that when I was working, so studied part-time. And, you know, that's great, but I think that never leaves you, or it hasn't me. So I never forget where I've come from. And when people talk and make that assumption in my world, I guess, about people going to university from 18, that it's a normal thing. Whereas the people I went to school with, you know, the boys became electricians, plumbers, whatever, and the girls became secretaries. There was never a kind of thinking that you would become a politician, for example. It just wouldn't be something in your thinking. You know, it's you'd be a hairdresser, or, you know, secretary or something like that, or a nurse. Nurse would be the kind of probably the pinnacle of what you would do.
So within all of that, sort of Irish family background, working class. How did you become aware of politics? Was that sort of woven into your upbringing, or did you read any particular books? What was it that awakened you to the left?
Yeah. So certainly my Irish relatives would discuss politics all the time, and particularly what was going on in Ireland and the kind of inequalities there in Northern Ireland. But I think what really alerted me to politics was something I heard all the time when I was a child, was that there would be a benefit. There's a benefit for somebody. And they weren't talking about social security benefits. What it meant was that when yet another man, dad, on a building site was killed, the Irish community would rally round and hold a benefit event for the family. And so you've got this sense of all these people are actually being injured and dying. That kind of was ingrained into me. So one of the first jobs I got, I mean, I initially worked in shops when I left school and things like that, but then I got sort of a slightly better job as an admin worker, but it was within a university setting. And so it was unionised. So by the time I was 19, I joined my first union and taken part in my first strike. So seeing what was happening to people in the workplace being injured, it kind of made me think about, you need some collective action, and thinking about what was going on in Ireland. And I would have relatives over who discussed politics, even though they themselves hadn't been to university or anything. They had a much kind of broader view about what was going on in the world and how it impacted on people. So I always had those discussions going on at home, but wasn't until I became involved in a trade union before I became involved in the Labour Party, actually, and then got involved in the Labour Party. But I think the thing that really, really got me more involved was the work that I do. So eventually I decided I wanted to do something else, and I became a volunteer in a citizens advice bureau. And I found that I was really good at it, and I quickly got a job. And at that time, there was a lot of Eritrean refugees coming to the UK. Not a lot, I should qualify that, because the UK take very few refugees, and I don't want to buy into the language of everything. But a lot of the clients I was dealing with were Eritrean refugees, and to hear their experience and then seeing how the system treated them. And then, like many people, I was desperate for a Labour government, because I was kind of on the left, you know, sort of identified as a socialist without really thinking about what that meant, just that I knew definitely wasn't a Tory and definitely, you know, agreed with but we had the Labour government come in then in 1997, and I was so happy, I can't tell you. I mean, I'd been so desperate for a Labour government. And then some of the first things they did was to cut benefits for single parents. But also one of the things that was unforgivable is they brought in the worst legislation ever for asylum seekers. So I knew lots of asylum seekers, dealing with them as women, as human beings. And at that time, their stories of what they'd been through, of what they told me, were quite incredible. And all you could have is admiration for the people and what they had experienced and what they'd done to get away. And it was never about finding a better life for economic reasons. It was because they were being persecuted. Many had been raped, tortured. And so then to come to the UK as a place of safety. But what happened was the Labour government in 2000 introduced legislation that meant asylum seekers could no longer work, get benefits. They couldn't even live where they wanted to. They had to be dispersed away from London and the southeast. It was so horrendous. So that kind of made me think, well, I'm definitely not on this side of it, and I'm definitely more left. And that's kind of continued as things have gone on, where my job has then developed to kind of analyse legislation that's coming in and seeing that sometimes Labour are absolutely appalling. And why is that? And when you look at who become politicians, they've not had the life experiences of many of us that see that. So I guess that's what's kind of driven me. And I've become more sort of radical as the older I get, I think.
Really. I find that quite interesting, because I got the same thing. I remember in 97, I was, because I was a teenage mum, and then a single mum at university, working class, a real fish out of water, really, and struggling on a really low income, and felt judged. It was a judgy time, wasn't it? The whole Thatcher era was dreadful, really. And when Labour got in, I remember the celebrations. I remember going and getting I think I bought like 3 different newspapers so I could look at the front pages and read through it all, and I've kept them. They're in the loft. So it's kind of when we have this thing between sort of people that are more on the centrist or moderate or right of the Labour Party might regard people on the left as just being difficult, they're just, why won't you just, why, or whatever. It's kind of, I had every faith with a slight bit of doubt, because I thought, politicians, can you ever trust them? The people that tend to get on in the world, as far as I'd seen it, they tend to be the people who know how to manipulate and how to, wend their way, into the top positions and things like that. I had this slight nagging doubt. I thought, does he really get it? Does he really get how this has been, this struggle over this, over this Thatcher era for people in working class families? Because I'd seen it with my own family, and having to really struggle to put food on the table and so on. And but I wanted to be wrong about that. I was so hopeful. And I've still got those newspapers, and I remember the hope that we all had, so. But then I wonder, because people who've hung doggedly onto that third way approach, that it, as it was called, what is it that, I wonder what it is that fires them up to be so determined that has to happen? Because I know what it is that fires me up, that's wrong. I know what it is that fires me up, that really, women have been forced to go to work when their kids are at a younger and younger age, and that started with the Blair era. And the idea of child tax credits, etc., was always going to put women at risk if a government came in that decided to then freeze those benefits and punish those women. It was never a better idea than making sure that a capitalist economy, if it can wash its own face, it should be able to pay people a decent wage, whatever job they're doing. It shouldn't need propping up by, the government through child tax credits. So it's kind of, there were a number of things that didn't add up and that made me kind of break away from this position of hope to this position of despair, and then PFI. And it's those things that fire me up to be left. And I do wonder what the hell it is that fires people up to be anti-left, if you know what I mean. I just really don't understand it.
I mean, sadly, I think it is just careerism. There's no other answer to it. Otherwise you should be in the Tory party. You shouldn't be attacking working class people or people who are poor or vulnerable in the Labour Party. So, I mean, at that time, kind of the early 2000s, I was working for the Child Poverty Action Group. And so I specialised in welfare benefits. I was writing a lot about it. And so many of the things that happened, for example, they complain about the northern towns and cities. Why have we lost support? Well, at that time, there was a kind of long-term sickness benefit called invalidity benefit. It then changed to incapacity benefit. But the rules on that, I mean, you had lots of people from mining communities, steel industries, who had lost their way of earning a living and who were on those long-term benefits. And what Labour did was constantly bring in more and more rules to make it harder and to stigmatise people who were on those benefits. So they're left with nothing. And then at the same time, they introduced rules that would bring asylum seekers from London, where they were kind of invisible, to be honest, they lived side by side, to move them into the very communities that were feeling that their sort of benefits, their way of life was being changed, and that they couldn't earn a living, they couldn't find anywhere to live. All of these things, it makes no sense at all. And it makes no sense to me that Labour do not understand what they have done, and that why we've got this situation in Scotland, in the northern cities and everywhere else.
Yeah.
Because it's the things that they've done. They abandon the working class, the very communities that they should be supporting.
Yeah, and we saw a decline as well in the number of working class people that are members of the Labour Party or that were representative as MPs, and that's dropped dramatically over those years. And there's loads of studies that kind of confirm that. So some of this alienation that sort of working class people have felt through that time has been entirely understandable. But one of the things that I've had said back to me when I've suggested that as the Labour Party, we need to be working twice as hard really to make sure that we're that we've got working class people, but we keep a space for them, that they're not squeezed out by people that have got better connections, or they're more used to public speaking, or whatever it is, because that's what naturally happens if you don't proactively carve out a space for people. And that's what has happened. And the thing that is often said back to me is, yeah, but you know, a lot of the working class now they're not socialist, and they're not interested, and they're racist, and you know, so and that's kind of used as a justification for, I don't know, but there's an inability to look at the damage that was done, and some of it sort of deliberately so through what sounds like a divide and rule. This classic divide and rule approach that is taken in policy terms. So if you're moving people, I mean, what you've got there is basically working class people. You know, if you're asylum seeker, your relationship to power is kind of the same as someone who has been sacked off by the government in terms of your industry and the support that you get. So you're all in the same boat in terms of your relationship to power, but you're naturally there's gonna be resentments that aren't talked about, aren't resolved. In Ireland, that Belfast, Trademark Belfast, they do anti-sectarian work in the workplace, and the particular skills, you know, that are needed for that, they would be kind of useful in some ways if we were going to try and re-embed socialism and a sense of working class identity that's multicultural, you know, across society. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that, you know, class is kind of been trying to be removed from politics, but hasn't it always? Haven't the middle classes always tried to say, you know, it's our domain? The working class, they don't know, they're this, they're that, you know, they're racist. They've always said that, actually. And the way that working class people got a foot in the door generally within politics was through the trade unions. And you often had people who would come up through the ranks who were just you know, shop steward in the workplace, but they would then move forward. And that's happening less and less, isn't it? So
yeah,
also the kind of political education that people would get. And I quite often hear people saying, oh, we need to politically educate people. But the people talking about it don't actually have the fundamentals, the basics to start that. So the political education that was very good came through the trade unions, because you would start with a workplace issue and people would see how collectively you could change things. And I was a shop steward for, oh God, I can't remember how long, but a long time, over a decade anyway, in the voluntary sector. And the voluntary sector, the charity sector, can be one of the worst. You know, you've got people at the top earning a huge amount and people at the bottom doing the work earning very little. So often I would hear people say, well, I can't join the union, I can't afford it, which is valid, you know. But when I was a shop steward, managed to get full membership, you know, within the workplace, and we achieved quite a lot. And then when people see that, they think wider, and you can go beyond that. And so we need a bit more of that, a good political education, and people seeing that they're being on a journey with people rather than being talked down to. And that's what happens so often, that you'll be talked at. You know, you'll hear people saying, we're going to work with the working class, as though there's some, you know, group at the zoo or something. You know, well, why aren't some of you working class in the first place? Who were involved in providing this education? You know, it's not a separate species. No. And, you know, much to kind of everybody's surprise, they're not all racist, you know. It's just ridiculous. And working class are not all white, of course. You know, they're kind of diverse. And,
yeah, no, it's really important. In terms of your involvement with the trade unions and labour, so how have you seen that change? You know, how has it become less working class? Has that happened? Have you seen it visibly change over the last 10 years, 20 years?
What, the trade unions or the Labour Party?
Sort of the membership and of trade unions, and who's, I mean, but one of the things that I think Paul O'Connell or someone has said recently, or it might have been someone from Trademark Belfast, actually, it was Stevie Nolan from Trademark Belfast, has said that within the union, because we still hear this thing that the unions are the place to go really for quality political education, and this is what everybody needs to do. And clearly, you know, we need to have stronger union involvement, and it's great, you know, we can see the example of what's happened with the NEU and schools at the beginning of the year, but their hands are tied to a certain extent, and we've seen that with the Big Bang and everybody having to go back. You know, it's kind of like, it's the strength that unions have has been vastly undermined. But also what Trademark Belfast was saying was that there's a more of an emphasis now within union education around skilling people up. It's more about workplace skills so that people can get a better job within the very system that's the problem in the first place, rather than deconstructing why the system is a problem in the first place, and that the balance has shifted in that direction. And also unions are fighting for better conditions within a system that is utterly broken. And I'm really interested in hearing more about your setup within the Law Centre, because you've got wage parity in a collectivised setting. And that, to me, I have to say, is more of an interesting approach in terms of breaking this cycle of exploitation of the working class, rather than trying to adapt it to be kinder to the working class. Yeah, what do you think?
So firstly, on trade unions in the workplace, one of the problems is the kind of type of work that working class people are in now is largely ununionized, and they have no kind of, secure job. So being within a union and active in a union, that's so much harder. So I said I was a trade unionist within the voluntary sector, and so frustrated at the way it was going, because you have got people on really high wages, and often they are men, and then the people kind of on lower wages are women. And they spout off about anti-poverty and all sorts of things, but they don't do it within their own structure. So I started with the idea of setting up a law centre in Harrow, where I live, in, I think, 2008. And initially I got no help at all. And actually a lot of the voluntary sector were quite anti it, because they saw another organisation that maybe would take funds away from them. But I did persist. And one of the things, I didn't actually ever intend working there, but it just kind of took over my life, and I ended up going to be there and working full time. But one of the things I was very clear at the start was that there should be pay parity. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a collective, because we do have a kind of hierarchy. So I'm the director, we have a senior solicitor, we have supervising solicitors, and we have admin work, we have an office manager. So people have different roles. And that would be seen elsewhere as, oh, you've got to have different levels of pay, but we don't. We all get paid the same. And it works remarkably well. And so it's just, nobody there feels, well, they're not pulling their weight and they're getting a whacking great salary. But more than that, it stops the gender pay gap, it stops the disability pay gap, it stops the race pay gap, which is prevalent everywhere. So it's a really good model, and it makes it very easy for me doing the payroll every month, or when people get a pay rise. And there's none of that negotiating and people who are more assertive arguing for a higher pay rise than somebody else. So it does work really well, but I can't tell you how many people who claim to be more left than me have real struggles with understanding why I should do that. And people keep telling me, but you should get a better paid job, Pamela. You shouldn't be paid the same as other people. But it does work well. And I kind of feel, well, we try to have enough, a salary that's a decent salary. It's never going to be huge in the voluntary sector, but it's a decent salary. It's not kind of poverty pay. And it means that everybody is paid a decent wage. And so if you're an admin worker, why are you less in need of money than somebody who's a director? You've still got the same bills to pay. And in many ways, I've got less bills to pay because I have a mortgage rather than extortionate rent that people have to pay in the private sector. So I'm really proud of that. And I cling on to that, because sometimes, people will say, well, don't you think we should just change? We could have, this, but we could pay less. And I really stick rigidly to that. And
brilliant. I love it. I absolutely love it. It's like if you're in a band and, well, we're going to pay this one that much because they had to train to play the drums for, 10 years or that one. But no, we'll pay him more because he's up front, and no, we'll pay him more because it sounds crap without him, and it's like, no, you just pay everyone the same, because it would be awful. It's not the same product really without all of those ingredients, and it saves all the
And
arguing.
everybody's important. Everybody has an important role. None of them are less important. Some people are perceived in society as having higher status, but why? It's only because of the pay structure that happens. And as we said when we started, we found out who are the most important workers in society. I'm desperate for a haircut. I am desperate. But all those shop workers, the people who run the trains, the buses, everything.
Yeah.
They are the important people, so why don't we value them?
Yeah, they've been brilliant and they've been amazing. When you go in the supermarket, and people have been serving us, when this started out and people were absolutely terrified, they were there, they must have been so scared. And for ages, there weren't even screens, were there? That seemed to come like way down the line, as a PPE was being sorted for other important services, but not for people that were seeing hundreds of people come past them every day, with their shopping and what have you, and the limited 3 items, no more than 3 items of orange juice or whatever. And they've been cheerful and they've been there, and they're heroes, absolute heroes. And, just thinking, we have to somehow break the mindset about, how some certain jobs are valued over others and certain skill sets are valued over others. And something that I really would like us to look more closely at sort of within the Labour Party is around mothering and caring and what that contributes to society, and the fact that that has no value attached to it at all, other than once a year on Mother's Day when, there's like this sentimental you're in trouble if you don't remember to get your mum a bunch of flowers from the garage or whatever. It's like, yeah. So it's not just about, or even just what money people need. It's also like, people bring different skills and people have opportunity is stacked within the system. The system would fall on its arse if everybody, suddenly had the opportunities to go and study at the top universities and prove themselves in that way. If everybody had suddenly access to private tuition and all of the other advantages, that get people into those positions, well, there'd be no one to serve in shops, sort of. So we have to acknowledge that in how we reward people, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's great because I think people need to see living, worked examples of organisations that are prepared to do what you've done and have everybody valued equally, kind of thing. It's amazing because it's awful as well that it sounds like pie in the sky to people on the left. It's really the core of what we should be about, Yeah.
I think there can be problems with collectives because what's happened is that sometimes people have said that in the end, you've got to have somebody to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's worked in this way. You've got a hierarchy, but everybody's paid the same. So it's kind of the best of the both worlds, I think.
Yeah. I think that the Belfast Women's Cleaning Company, they've got I think they've got a flatline or close to flatline wage structure. I think it is flatline actually. And they make decisions collectively as a democracy. But there is one person who is probably pushing it along, leading on it sort of thing. And that happens naturally, but no one minds that, maybe that's her skills, we're all different. And maybe some other people are happy to do, the bulk of the decision making collectively, but certain things are going to be driven by someone who's in a, who likes doing that. So it's it's fine, isn't it? It's horses for courses, but I just think it's great that everybody's valued equally for who they are,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your work in the Law Centre and your insight in terms of so women's access to the law. Is it mainly women that you see?
It's not totally women, but there's a higher percentage of women. So it's probably breaks down, varies sometimes, but definitely 60% women, sometimes 70% women. It's more likely to be women.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps unsurprising because of the kind of levels of poverty and the impact of, changes in law have impacted particularly on women. So, so not solely, but a lot of the clients are women.
Okay. So in terms of the breakdown, is it mainly working class women that you see, or do you have, obviously middle class women will be in abuse situations, etc., and require support as well, because as we know, that occurs across the whole of society. Although my understanding is it predominantly, it falls more heavily.
It's more the people, the people we see are predominantly working class and quite vulnerable. And that's probably because, yes, if you're in a middle class, if you're middle class and you're still going to be affected by things like domestic violence, it's across the board, but you may have other options. You may have access to legal advice that you can pay for. You may have money to be able to get out of the situation. That's not always a given, but, you just may have more options than somebody who is working in a really low paid job and doesn't even know where to go. Some people don't even know really what lawyers do. They see them on the telly and, you know, they cost a lot of money, but they're not for ordinary people. And people often don't understand what solicitors, private practice solicitors, are saying to them because they don't understand how to communicate with clients. And we've seen that frequently when a client, if it's an area of law that we don't cover, for example, and they have to go to a solicitor in private practice, they'll often come back and say, but what do they mean? They've said this, what do they mean? So people don't take the time to kind of explain, you know, that's not true of all private practice solicitors, obviously. I'm sure some are really good. In general, if you're working in a law centre setting, you know the types of issues and how to extract information and how to listen, really listen to people to understand what's going on. Because people might present with one issue, but it's not the main issue that's really impacting them. So it might be that somebody's come with one thing, but then when they get to trust you, you'll find that there's an abusive relationship or there's something else that's going on that you can deal with. And that often with the clients we see, there are multiple problems, you know, from housing to immigration. I mean, some of the trafficking cases are really quite horrendous, and you wouldn't think that that is going on, you know, in Harrow, in a suburb in London, and yet it is, and it's quite shocking. And people are oblivious to this, really. You know, they don't really get it. And equally, the kind of benefits issues, you know, one of the cases we dealt with this week, which is one at a tribunal, is a woman who was drug dependent, but she had changed her life. She turned it around and everything. And I think she had a job now, but anyway, she was told she'd been overpaid benefit by the DWP to the tune of £17,000. And she was so stressed by it. She didn't know what to do. She just kept getting these letters. She didn't understand what laws they were referring to. And we represented her and we won the case. So she doesn't owe them £17,000. It was an error on the DWP's part. But she was getting so stressed. She was thinking about returning to, you know, taking some drugs. But with the support of the law centre, she didn't. So that's like life-changing for somebody. And we've had cases of a woman who her benefit was removed after she had mental health illness, and she had her benefit taken away after a work capability assessment where they see if you're really unfit to work. And her benefit was taken away. She was without benefit for 2 years. Her landlord didn't evict her. So she was really lucky in that sense. But she had literally no money for food or anything. She was going to the food bank occasionally. But at that time, food bank attendance was limited to 3 times a year, and they made you feel like you couldn't go more, even though you were hungry. And she had started to take sleeping tablets or something to make her sleep during the days that she wasn't hungry. I mean, how appalling is that? And that's before COVID. This has been going on for, you know, a long time. But again, we succeeded and got all her benefits back for her, got her £22,000.
Wow.
And can you imagine? That's kind of life-changing for someone.
Yes.
But where do you go if you don't know that you can challenge things? And most people don't, you know, they don't know you can appeal the decision by the DWP. And if so, how do you do it? You know, it's really scary going to a hearing on your own, not knowing what you're supposed to say, and you're going to be judged by somebody. It's a horrible thing.
It is, yeah. And I think for a lot of women who are sort of working class, they're already kind of in an edgy situation in terms of their income, in terms of what that does to your mental health as well. The pressures, the normal pressures of being a parent, children. I mean, Lisa McKenzie was talking about how schools are different. They treat working class parents differently. And that a lot of working class women that she's interviewed and worked with are almost constantly in a battle with the school for one reason or another, and the school kind of battles against them on silly things that can be really unimportant because there's judgment there, like an unconscious sort of biased judgment, prejudice or whatever.
That's absolutely the case. And one of the posts that we put, so we've developed the Law Centre over the years to deal with the issues that are coming up. So one of them is somebody who deals with young people, children and young people. And a lot of that is representing people who are being excluded from schools, challenging those decisions, and often just having a solicitor kind of intervening, even without going to tribunal, is, you know, better. And I'll just give you an example of one case this happened. It was a young lad who, Somali, from a family of 12, and the mother had quite severe mental health difficulties. They were living in property with rats. It was everything you could imagine. And when his mother had an episode, he quite often kicked off at school, and he was suspended once, and then they were talking about excluding him permanently. And we didn't have anybody else to represent him at the time, so I went with him to the school to a hearing and explained that he was just as much a vulnerable child. He'd actually was accused of beating up a disabled child. It couldn't be any worse, really, you know, so they were going to. But what he told me was that he's always the one that's identified as the troublemaker. And so he just felt it was really unfair. So we managed to get him not expelled. And then I was talking to him about, like, I get so angry about things, but I don't go around beating people up. What I do is I use the pen and the computer and I challenge things, and that's what I do. And I use all the resources I've got. And so he got interested, and I invited him to do some work experience at the law centre. So he came along. He was only about 14 at the time, and he was a bit shruggy shoulders about, you know, whatever. But what we were recruiting a solicitor at the time. So I got him to sit on the panel and got him to choose who he thought should be the solicitor. And we did pick the person. We wouldn't if it was a terrible person, but we did go with his choice. So he felt invested. So I can't claim that this was something that changed his life completely, but his dad came in several years later and said that he was now at university, and we got a card from him, and he was on the road, I can tell you, to being gangs, running drugs for people. And those kind of little interventions, sometimes by a school, somebody, an adult, just giving that time to somebody can make such a difference. We also got the family rehoused and sorted out the benefits and everything else. So actually huge improvement in their lives, actually. You know, I feel really proud when I kind of think of things like that you make a real difference.
So if you've got the income, you can buy in the mental health support, can't you? So it doesn't get to that level. It doesn't get to that stage where your kids are sort of acting up at school. You don't have to wait, you know, 6 months, 2 years, or whatever it is on the CAMS waiting list. And it'll be the working class parents that are having to deal with that pressure at the same time as having an unwell child, and all of the stress of that, and all of the stress of not having enough money. And maybe you've got rats, or maybe you've got other issues, you know, you've got antisocial, you know, someone throwing stuff at your windows or whatever it is. It's a completely different life situation that you cannot possibly imagine being that level of disempowered if you've not been there. So you know, in terms of kind of women's invisibility within law, working class women's invisibility within law, within politics at a level where you can influence things, how important do you think it is that we make an extra effort within the party, given that that's the outcome for working class women, if the law is not on their side, if the services aren't recognising how it treats them and how they experience that situation differently because of their class, because of their poverty? So the question is around sort of, for example, if you had working class women in a position to change the law, so that it was more supportive of people in those kinds of situations, what would the main changes be? What would you expect them to?
Interesting you say that. I used to be a trustee of the Women's Budget Group, and the Women's Budget Group is very small. And when I was a trustee, we were very hands-on. So it was like being an employee, really. And we spent, I think, 2 years on a project with women in poverty and all working class women. And what we did was to kind of skill them up to understand the system, first of all, whether it's how the council works, how the DWP work, how you challenge things, and then to encourage them to kind of be able to speak in safe groups, because many of them they're not debating societies at university, they're not at the local Labour Party speaking up in a CLP or anywhere else. So it was very frightening for them to speak in a setting. But we had lots of workshops, and that culminated in a meeting in Parliament with MPs, female MPs, and members of the Lords and senior civil servants, where they decided what laws they needed to make their lives easier. So they came up with them. And one of the things, and it was before the Equalities Act, they came up with was an Equalities Act.
Right.
And so we had, and what was really nice was, politicians in the end didn't really change the laws to make anything better for them. But the journey of those women, some of them subsequently stood for things in their community, and whether it was as a councillor or on the parents committee, but they felt that they really were empowered. So I get sick of hearing about people saying we're going to empower this one and the other without thinking about what it means, because you can't just say come along and be this, because you're setting people up to fail, because you're not in that world or mindset, are you? So that was a really good exercise on how. But obviously it stopped after 2 years. It was a project that we did. We brought people together. I mean, that was over 10 years ago that happened. But I think that's a really good example. And I guess that's what used to happen in trade unions, that people gradually would get their voice and feel confident, wouldn't they, in the work?
They get their voice and their skills, and those softer skills, like being able to stand up and use your voice, you know, in a meeting or whatever it is. But get the political education backdrop to that as well, so that people become aware of why they're disempowered and angry about it. And I don't know, I mean, I feel it's important that people who've been oppressed and are oppressed fully understand and are allowed to be angry and go through that anger phase. Like you were saying about, you know, the lad, it's natural for him to feel angry. Why wouldn't he? He was, you know, he's in an unfair situation, and kids can see that. I mean, people can see that. So it's then what you do with that anger. But if you suppress that anger and you try and gloss over that conversation about why it's unfair and how that works, I think you empowerment can't happen. Re-empowerment can't happen.
Oh, absolutely agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. What about, so at the moment, I don't know if it's the same with you, but it seems to me a lot of what happens within the Labour Party is there's a lot of celebration at the local level about food banks, and a lot of celebration of, well, there's been this outpouring of volunteer spirit, and isn't that great? And, you know, we've fed X number of people, and aren't we great? And, you know, it's like, I don't know, that emphasis on the food banks have to be there. Why? I don't know. If it was balanced, I would rather hear more of a conversation rather than this focus on food banks, you know, and this fascination, almost like a morbid fascination with food banks. I would like to hear more discourse about the rights and the lack of rights and the lack of access to the law and all of these things that kind of underpin why people need food banks in the first place. That conversation doesn't seem to be at the forefront to the extent that the conversation around food banks is, or even celebrating that, you know, voluntary spirit kind of thing. I just don't know. It feels in a way as if we've lost our way in terms of what we're here supposed to be doing. Yeah.
So I started kind of in rights-based work as a welfare rights worker, not as a charity worker. I never see myself as a charity worker. It's about ensuring people's rights. And throughout the last decade, with the growth of food banks, I've really been against them and angry for exactly the same reasons, in particular because they stigmatise people, because you could only go there 3 times. You had to say why you needed food. Why else would somebody need food? In Harrow, we've got a better one now that you can go there's no sort of form filling, you just turn up and you get food when you need it. So I accept that that's a necessity, and it's better to do it that way than anything. However, what I really disagree with is quite a lot of people on the left think the answer to us losing the election in 2019 and Jeremy no longer being the leader is that we immerse ourselves locally. Now that's fine, but what they mean is activism locally means things like mutual aid groups and delivering food parcels and other things like this. Now, there's nothing bad in itself, but if that's all you're going to do, and I've worked in the so-called charity sector pretty much all my life now, and it's a band-aid. Now, the best of it are places like law centres, which actually go in and they challenge, they make long-standing changes, not just for the individual, but can actually change the law. That's the best of it. But otherwise, it is a band-aid. You are not, you know, even things like eviction resistance, I hate to say, but, you know, the thought that what is going to help somebody facing eviction is a lot of people turning up and standing outside your house when the bailiffs are coming. I grew up and I lost my home several times. The last thing my parents would have wanted was being drawn attention to that you were too poor to keep your home. But also, it means that, you know, these days, most people, certainly in London, in Harrow anyway, are reliant, if you're poor, on the private rented sector, not on council housing. So you constantly this churn of trying to find somewhere else to live.
Yes.
So if you are resistant to eviction, that's fine. You might gain yourself a couple more days, but what's going to happen is that you will never be able to rent a private property again because you won't get a reference or anything else.
Yeah.
So by contrast, like over the lockdown, there's been lots of illegal evictions. So one man, for example, very vulnerable man, was being threatened with eviction because he'd lost his job. He hadn't paid his rent for a couple of months because he was waiting for universal credit. And his landlord threatened eviction. So the law centre told the landlord, if you do that, it'll be a criminal offence and we'll apply to the court, not only to get the tenant back in, but we'll seek damages from you. Landlord didn't really take much notice and he evicted on a Friday evening the person. So you could have had people outside the person's home, preventing the landlord doing it, and the landlord just comes back the next day and changes the locks. But the law centre made an application to the court on the Monday. Landlord had acted illegally. The tenant got his keys back the following day, and the landlord was forced to pay nearly £20,000 in damages. So what's the better route? And I just find a lot of things that are going on at the moment is performance politics. And I'm sorry if that upsets people, but it's what is going to help the individual rather than make you feel better. It might make you feel better going to deliver a parcel. It might make you feel better standing outside somebody's house and getting a photograph of you that you can then later use when you're standing as a candidate. It won't make that individual. And I know that because I work with people every day of the week who are in these situations.
That's a really interesting term, performance politics. I hadn't heard that before, but it's so true. And it makes me think about the role of the unions, because they do know how to play this game, in terms of kind of selections, elections and all the rest of it. They know it like the back of their hand. So they will, when they've decided who it is they feel they can trust and they're going to put them forward, there'll be certain things that they're trained to do and certain things they're told to do. And getting those kinds of photos and stockpiling them ahead of time is one of those things, but there's something cheesy and kind of disingenuous about it that's always grated, really.
When I was a parliamentary candidate, and that was exactly what I was asked, have you got all these photos? And I said, no, I needed my family. And I was told that most right-wingers, careerists, they have a portfolio of photographs ready to go for the next position they go for. And I've never had that. In fact, I hate it. I really hate all that.
It's awful that you have to compete on those terms, isn't it? Because you've got this professionalisation of left politics or of Labour politics or whatever. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of, before we wind up, because we've been chatting for quite a while and I know you're really, really busy, but I just wanted to bring up this thing at the moment. There seems to be a new trend. There's so many different ways that we get distracted or railroaded away from talking about the issue of invisibility of the working class within the left. And within the Labour Party, like the public face of the party is not something that says to the working class, this is your natural political home, you're welcome, we understand you, kind of thing. It used to be to a much greater extent. I don't think it was ever fully representative, in terms of the proportion of the population that were, working in manual work or routine low status work or whatever, low pay. But it's virtually invisible now, and it's the one area that we seem to talk about the least, and it's the one area of equalities legislation that isn't really covered. I think it is to some extent in Wales and Scotland, but it's not in England. So there isn't even that protection in the law. So one of the arguments that sometimes gets used is, we can only proactively act on equalities representation to the extent that the law supports us to. But, I did this survey recently, and it was just an off-the-cuff thing on a little free platform. And I sent it out to a few people, some of the women that were the mature women, working class students who've gone on to become academics. And they're building networks across academia of working class academics. And there's a new journal that's been launched, etc. And through that, within 2 days, I had 300 responses from people who identify as being working class. And so some of the questions that I asked was kind of, to what extent has your politics been influenced by your social class? And 57% of the respondents said that they were 100% socialist. But of those, 26% said that they were left-wing. Alongside that, 20% of them 26% of them said that they were left-wing, but they felt alienated within the left. And we've got this kind of conversation about how, at the moment, about how the people who've borne the worst brunt of the pandemic are the youth. That seems to be the latest thing. And then, you know, we're standing as candidates for the Women's Committee, and one of the things that we talk about a lot is how women have been disproportionately impacted, and they have, you know, there's no saying that they haven't. But it's kind of like, in terms of who's been dying, you know, in greater numbers, and in terms of people who've been in the most vulnerable jobs, and in terms of the people who are invisible within the Labour Party, it's not middle class women, and it's not middle class young people. Absolutely not. You know, it's in all cases, and if you're talking about ethnicity or disability or whatever it is, in all cases, it's the working class within those groups that are invisible. And focusing on one or other of those things and ignoring class means that that's never ever going to be addressed. Never going to be addressed. And I'm so frustrated by it, because one of these articles the other day described people who are arguing for better visibility and representation of working class people within the left, within Labour, as chuntering. We're described as chuntering, you know, and it's kind of, we're getting put down and it's being sidelined every which way it can be thought of to be sidelined. And I just wonder why in a socialist party on the left that would be happening.
I think it's always happened. I mean, it's the working class are the ones who've always fought for and achieved the rights that we've gained. And the middle classes have always tried to wear our clothes, to use our experiences. And so often when they get into, it's to get into positions of power, when they get into positions of power, they abandon the working class. So for me, it always starts with class, always. And the other issues stem from that. So people have always tried to use race and gender to divide people, to try to kind of undermine the working class and their struggle. And that's what's happening now again. So yes, okay, young people, they have had things really bad, absolutely. But some young people have had things much worse than others. So we talk about student debt. And often the people kind of talk about student debt, you know, are middle class people rather than the working class students. So you have a load of young people being encouraged to go on to university education, all coming out with debt. But some of those degrees will be less valuable than other degrees. Absolutely. So we all know that when employers are going through, they'll look at the kind of red brick universities. And I still hear in my circles, people laughing that somebody went to, you know, an old poly or something like that. Well, that's not a real degree, is it? So ordinary people won't possibly understand the difference between going to one university or the other. So they're all in debt. Other people coming out of university, yes, they might, you know, be saddled with debt, but will be on their road to getting a good job, or they'll have the connections, you know, they'll be thinking about going into politics and have connections, getting in, you know, place with an MP. Other people come out of university and they're working in shops and bars and all the rest of it. So there is a difference. And in the same with women, it's not enough just to put tokenistic women, you know, the thing about let's get more women in parliament, then things will change. Well, that happened, you know, remember the dreadful term Blair's babes or whatever it was in 1997. And what, as we've said, were the things that they did. They did not do things that empowered women. And that moved to a real discussion about the kind of strivers and skivers, good families, good women and bad, you know. So we need kind of, and particularly highlighted with kind of migrant women and asylum seekers. So it's not enough to have young people, let's just get young people, let's just get women, let's just get minorities, because we need people who understand the class issue and how that impacts, and will stick to that, not abandon it as soon as they get a position of power. And so many of our politicians do that. You know, if we followed that kind of thinking, we shouldn't have had Jeremy as leader, because obviously he's a white man, fairly privileged background, you know, he would say that himself. You have to think about what are the ideas and principles that people adhere to, and people who have a good understanding of class. And Jeremy does have that, and other politicians do. So we have to bring it back to the fundamentals. And I think, you know, it's about a battle for power yet again, and we shouldn't be hoodwinked by this. We need to keep bringing it back to class. And if people don't understand that, we need proper political education, and that's what's missing. And what's also happening these days are people get attacked for even raising this as an issue.
Yeah.
And we've got to stop that. We've got to have proper debate and understanding, because we don't grow otherwise. I've been fortunate to learn, you know, my kind of politics from some really fantastic people over the years. It's a kind of journey again, isn't it? I didn't learn it at, you know, university or anything else, or in a student debating whatever. So
yeah. I mean, I love Jeremy, and I joined Labour on the day that he was elected. I should have got involved before then, but I'd given up, and I didn't give it enough. I'd given up, and I didn't have my full attention on it. Just thought, oh, that won't happen. But when he did, you know, get elected, I was like, right, I'm getting stuck in. You know, this could be it. But I also feel that, you know, that's sometimes been used when I've sort of tried to raise the issue of, you know, the lack of working class representation in our own right. People have said, you know, well, look at Jeremy, you support Jeremy, don't you? And he's not working class. It doesn't matter about what class background someone is, it's their politics. And it's kind of like, you can't, it's good that he does have that understanding of class. And I think he did massively broaden the appeal again of the Labour Party and the policies that he was pushing forward. But you know, a lot of the people that support Jeremy and Jeremy himself, they're really interested in sort of, I mean, I am, because I did my degree in development studies, studied how it's like sociology, but on a international level. So why are some countries, you know, kept impoverished by others? How does that work? And it's the same thing in a macrocosm. If you look within each country, how are some people kept impoverished and powerless by others? How does that system work? So I'm interested in that. But I understand that for most working class people, things like the environment, things like international social justice and, you know, development and stuff like that, they are way down on the agenda of survival. And so I think it is still really, really important that we have our fair share of people who have walked that walk, you know, who have a good understanding of socialist politics, but understand that, you know, we're not one mass of the 99%. Within that 90%, there is that other dividing line, and it's still significant and it still matters. And if we don't acknowledge that, and we don't adapt to make sure that we're inclusive, you know, of that, then we're not ever going to be relevant to that group of people that have just rejected us, you know, in 2019, because it's been a long time coming.
I think we need both, because of course we do have some very obvious people who come from a working class background who are MPs who abandon their class. So we need people from a working class background who have a good understanding of what the class issue is and our struggles, and are not going to abandon that. You know, we need solid socialists rather than
alongside comrades that are middle class that haven't abandoned the working class as well. I agree. Well, that has been an amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed it. There's other things I wanted to chat about, but I think we probably could be here all day. So I just wanted to say thanks, and just also to give you an opportunity if there's anything else that you want to, any other thoughts or...
No, it's been great talking to you. So I look forward, if we're both on the Women's Committee, of putting forward some great policy suggestions. I think it's a real opportunity. So
it really
delighted
is.
If you get elected and we're both on there, it'd be fantastic. So.
Fab. Thank you so much. And just to remind everybody, please make sure that you get good socialist women along to your CLPs as soon as you can, if you're in Purda, as soon as possible after Purda, and rally the left and make sure that you vote for good left delegates to go to a women's conference, and vote for the Grassroots Labour Women team plus Solma Ahmed for Momentum for Women's Committee. Thank you.
Democracy.